But then we also are going to take a bunny hop to the book of Job. So if you want to find both of those spots, Romans chapter 9, and then just get your finger in the book of Job, you'll see how they go together. We're going to be looking at the question that we skipped over last week. In Romans chapter 9, Paul gets to a point where he is led to ask the rhetorical question, is there unrighteousness with God? So we'll talk about that. I'm going to pray, and then we'll dive in. Father, thank you for another opportunity to spend time in your word, relaying the things that you've taught me and shared with me this last week, the last few weeks, as we study not only just Romans, but also look into the life and the man Job and the different principles inside that massive book. I ask that you would open our hearts and minds to receive what you have for us today. I ask, Father, that you'd help us to everything that we learned today, that it would draw us closer to you, maybe understand your heart a little bit more. We'll never understand you fully, but I ask that you would open our eyes to see maybe just another side of you that we haven't seen before. I ask that you would be with those that are not with us, whether in travel, maybe still yet, or that are sick, or that are away visiting. I ask that you would put your hand on them, protect them for whatever may be out there to try to harm them. I ask that you would gird them up and bring them back to us safely. We ask that in your name, amen. Is there unrighteousness with God? Paul asked this question in Romans chapter 9, verse number 14. But this question is different than many other questions that Paul asked in Romans. Paul brings this question up against almost God's integrity and his judgment. Most of the time, Paul asks a question that the reader may be thinking, right? He'll lead you up to a point and say, okay, well then what about this? And then he answers it immediately. What could Paul have said, or what facts or series of events did Paul talk about to get to the point where he asked the rhetorical question, is there unrighteousness with God? Is God's integrity compromised, or is he unjust? So he leads us in a series of facts or events that start in verse number 9 of chapter 9. He points out 6 different things that would lead him to the question, is God unrighteous? Or is God unjust? So first, he points out in verse number 9, the fact that Sarah was not able to bear children until God said that she was allowed to bear children. So verse number 9, for this is the word of promise. At this time will I come, and Sarah shall have a son. So just the fact that Sarah was never able to have a child until God told her, okay, now you're going to be able to have a child. And of course we know that she was well stricken in years, so beyond childbearing age. That's the first thing he points out, but then immediately he points out another almost injustice. Okay, verse number 10 through 13 of chapter 9. Verse number 10 begins, and not only this, so not only pointing out that kind of maybe an injustice, not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one, even by our father Isaac, and he puts in parentheses here, for the children being not yet born, neither having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him that calleth, it was said unto her, the elder shall serve the younger. As it is written, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. So what injustice does he pull out here? Before these 2 children were even born, when they were in the womb, before they could have ever even known to do good or evil, God says, well, the older child is going to serve the younger child, almost as if God's picking favorites. Okay, so these are just things that Paul's pointing out. Okay, what else does he point out? Number 3, he points out that God chooses who he will and will not have mercy on. Verse number 15 and 16 of chapter 9. For he saith to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it is not of him that willeth, nor him that runneth, but of God that showeth mercy. So he points out another seeming unjust or inconsistent attribute of God. God picks and chooses who he wants to have compassion on. Okay, let's continue. Number 4, he points out the fact that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now that's one that maybe we all have kind of thought, like, how does that work? God picks somebody that's not going to be repentant and puts his judgment on him. Paul points this fact out, verse number 17 and 18. For the scripture saith unto Pharaoh, even for this same purpose have I raised thee up, that I might show my power in thee, and that my name might be declared throughout all the earth. Therefore he hath mercy on whom he will have mercy, and whom he will hardeneth. So God seemingly chose Pharaoh. It says that I raised you up. The reason why you were born is for me to show my power over you. Okay, this is Paul pointing this out. Number 5, he points out the fact that God calls Israel his children, but only a few of them are going to be saved. Verse number 27 and 28, we're going to jump down just a little bit. Verse number 28, Isaiah also, this is the prophet Isaiah, also crieth concerning Israel, the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, a remnant shall be saved. So a small portion, or a very small remain, shall be saved. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. So wait a minute. He tells Abraham, you're going to have a great nation, and they're going to be my children, and I'm going to be their father. And he talks about this all throughout the Old Testament. And by the time he gets to Isaiah, he says, well, there's only a remnant that are actually going to be saved. And actually, all throughout the New Testament, we see Paul and the apostles and Jesus himself is begging the Jews to come to Christ, and they just refuse. So how can they be God's children, but then yet refuse God, and only a remnant are going to be saved? Then last thing that he points out, in which this kind of pertains to the book of Romans, he points out the fact that unrighteous Gentiles can attain righteousness. Verse number 24 through 26, and then we'll read 30 and 31. So verse number 24 begins by saying, even us, Paul's lumping himself in there because he is a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin. He says, even us, whom he hath called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. As he saith in Hosea, which is the book of Hosea, I will call them my people, which were not my people, and her beloved, which was not beloved. So God's going to call Gentiles his people. Verse number 26, and it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, ye are not my people, there shall they be called the children of the living God. What shall we say then? This is verse number 30 now. Jump down to verse number 30. What shall we say then? That the Gentiles, which followed not after righteousness, have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness which is of the faith? Verse number 31, but Israel, which followed after the law of righteousness, hath not attained the law of righteousness. This seems like the ultimate injustice. We have Gentiles who don't know anything about God. They don't know anything about, how they came out of Egypt and how the Lord dwelt among them in tabernacles and how he rescued them and he gave them David and all of these promises. The Gentiles, they don't know, they don't care, but then at the flip of a switch, they can be saved and now can be counted righteous. But then we have Israel, who has always followed the commandments and the laws of God, and God doesn't count them righteous. And we understand that that's because being a true Israelite, being a child of God, comes by faith, not by obedience to the law. So in this, Paul plays prosecutor almost against God, and he brings 6 very compelling arguments if you were going to say God does not rule by the justice system. He doesn't rule, obviously, by fairness, because it's not fair that he would pick and choose groups of people, or he would pick Jacob over Esau. Paul's bringing some very compelling. Now, we know that Paul is not questioning God's integrity. He's just pointing out 6 very short facts of how you could be led to the question, is there unrighteousness with God? Is he unjust? Does he not rule fairly? Which, as I was studying this, I was also reading through, listening through, and my wife and I were both looking at the book of Job. This is seemingly the theme of the book of Job. Is God not fair? Why did this happen to Job? The good majority of the book of Job is men trying to figure out this inconsistency with God. Does he rule justly? Does he not rule justly? Why did this happen to Job? We don't know. So I'm going to take this time, and while we're still on this topic of, is God unrighteous? Does he rule by the justice system? So we're going to look at the book of Job. I know this seems like a complete sidetrack, but it's really not. It's right on track. So same arguments can be made in the book of Job. This is not the first or the last person that will point out seemingly inconsistent judgment or inconsistencies in God's character. Is God unrighteous? Is he unjust? Is he inconsistent? So quick overview of the book of Job, and we all kind of have an understanding of what's in the book of Job. But we have characters. We have Almighty God who is on his throne. We see him on his throne ruling. We'll see that in chapters 1 and 2. Then we have Satan, who goes back and forth between the earth, and he lives up to his name, Satan, which means the adversary. In Hebrew, it's actually the Satan, which is not a person's name. It simply means the adversary. Maybe we'll talk about that at the very end. We have Satan. Then we have Job and his family. We have Job and his wife, which God views them as one flesh. It's actually a beautiful picture of even before we had the law, before the law was given to Moses. You have a beautiful picture of Job and his wife, one flesh, because he tells Satan, you can touch everything but my servant Job. At the end of the day, everything's dead and gone except for Job and his wife, because God views them as one flesh. So God says, don't touch my servant Job. That's both of them. They're one. Okay, we have Job's family and all of his possessions, and they were very great. In verses 1 through 3, we see that he has 7 sons, 3 daughters, 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, so it would be a team. So he's got 1,000 oxen, 500 she-asses, and a very great household. So that Job was the greatest man of all the men of the East. That says right there in verse number 3. Job's very rich, very righteous man. Then we have another characters in the story, which is you're going to see in chapters 3 through 37. You have Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu. These are some of Job's friends. This is the main portion of the book of Job, just by quantity. Quick breakdown of the plot in chapters 1 and 2, the famous attack on Job. Satan goes to God, and God says, have you considered my servant Job? Satan then has free reign on Job's life, destroys Job and his family. Verses 3 through 37, Job and his friends have a long conversation about God's justice, God's judgment, and God's righteousness. Then it's finished up in chapters 38 through 42, where God, out of a whirlwind, answers Job directly, very directly, to some of the questions and the inquiries that Job and his friends had. Okay, so we're going to look at chapters 1 and 2, and then we'll look at chapters 3 through 37. So chapters 1 and 2, we see that Job is a very righteous man. So verse number 1. There's a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. That man was perfect and upright. Perfect not as in sinless, but perfect as in completely mature. That's what Christ says, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Can we be sinless like God? No. But he portrays all the attributes of God. It was his pure intention was to do God's work. So that's perfect, completely mature and upright, one that feared God, eschewed evil. Verse number 5, this is how righteous of a man Job was. Verse number 5, and this was actually spoke to me as a father. Verse number 5, and it was so that when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctifies them. He rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all, according to the number of all of his children. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus Job did continually. Job not only was very righteous personally, but he was a spiritual leader and a spiritual head for all of his children. He rose up early and he took sacrifices to God and offered it on their behalf. Just in case maybe one of my sons sinned, I'm going to ask God to forgive their sins as well. I'm going to be an intercessor on their behalf. Okay? Job trusted God. In fact, Job may have been the most trusted man by God at this point on the face of the earth. How do we know that? Well, one, Job was the first man that God thought of when Satan was looking for somebody to attack. The Lord asked Satan, he says, what are you doing? He says, I'm just going to and fro from the earth. Verse number 8. Let's look at verse number 8. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? So who brought up the topic of Job? Was it Satan? No. It was actually God. God trusted Job. He was the first man that God thought was righteous, was upright. He was the model Christian. If God was setting up an institute on how to be a Christian, it was Job was the model Christian. And he also trusted Job's character against Satan himself. God knew that Job loved him with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength, and he knew that he could trust Job's integrity and his character against whatever Satan could possibly bring. And we know, as the story goes on, Satan brings everything. He destroys Job, top to bottom. God allows Satan to afflict Job. In all of this, Job remained faithful to God, and even though his own flesh wanted to curse God, remember, Job and his wife are one flesh. And his own flesh told him, curse God and die. In verse number 9 of chapter 2, if you want to flip forward. Verse number 9 of chapter 2, then his wife said unto him, dost thou still retain thy integrity? Are you still going to stay in character? Are you still going to have this facade that God's good no matter what? Even though everything's destroyed now, you lost all your cattle, you lost all of our children are gone, your possessions are all gone. Are you still going to remain in character? Are you going to still retain thy integrity? What does she say at the end of verse number 9? Curse God and die. Job's faithfulness to God and his integrity remained steadfast. If you look at chapter 1, verses 20 through 22, this is immediately after all of the treachery happens to Job. Chapter 1, verse number 20 and 22. Then Job arose, he rent his mantle, he shaved his head, and he fell upon the ground and worshipped. Verse number 21, and said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Verse number 22, in all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. We're going to go into the next section, section 3 through 37, which is Job's conversation with his friends. But before we get into this section, we have to remember that in this dialogue between Job and his friends did not have chapter 1 and 2. They only have one fact. They don't have the fact that Satan went to God. We don't have the fact that God trusted Job. We don't have any of this. All they have is that Job's life got divinely destroyed, because it was not like a happenstance. All at the same time, his family, all of his possessions, everything, he just got annihilated. It was divine destruction. That's the only fact that they have to go on before we cast any judgment on Job and his attitude, before we cast any judgment on Job's friends. All that they know is that Job's life got divinely destroyed. They didn't have chapter 1 or 2. They didn't have the record of verse number 22 of chapter 1, which we just read, that says Job did not sin or charged God falsely. And then verse number 10, it says that Job did not sin with his lips, meaning that he didn't say anything that was wrong in this situation. He didn't curse God. He didn't blame God for anything. They didn't have those two verses where it says Job was innocent in all of this. Job was perfect and upright. God was the one that basically wagered his character against Satan's character. They don't have any of that. All they are going under the surmising is Job got destroyed by God. Okay, so here is where we come into this next section. It's chapter 3 through 37. There's a lot of scripture that we can point out to show these accusations that come against Job, Job's defense, but I'm going to try to briefly just point out some of the major verses that would lead us to believe these conclusions. First of all, in chapter 4, we see Eliphaz accuses Job of sinning. All of this happened because Job sinned. Cast your eyes on chapter 4, verses 7 through 9. Verse number 7 in chapter 4 begins by saying, remember, I pray thee, who ever perished being innocent? Or where were the righteous cut off? Eliphaz is looking at the facts. The facts are God preserves the righteous, right? And he brings death and destruction to those who sin. So where did somebody who is innocent ever be spared? Or where were the righteous ever cut off? Verse number 8, he says, even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his nostrils they are consumed. Eliphaz points out the fact that God is just, and he punishes wickedness. And he points out some actually very biblical principles that when you sow wickedness, you reap it, right? Even Christ says that. Job obviously sinned, and he's being punished for his sin. That's what he is bringing the accusation. Job obviously sinned, and God is obviously punishing him for that sin. Job, in chapter 6, he answers basically saying, I'm innocent. I never sinned. Chapter 6, verses 28 through 30. Here's what he says. Verse number 28 of chapter 6, he says, Now therefore be content. Look upon me, for it is evident unto you if I lie. Return, I pray you, let it not be iniquity. Yea, return again, my righteousness is in it. Is there iniquity in my tongue? Cannot my taste discern perverse things? Job is saying, look at me, look at my life. Do you see any unrighteousness? Do you think I also don't know if I sinned or not? It says, can my taste not discern perverse things? If I would have sinned, do you think I would have known that? And based on what you can see in me, does it look like I've sinned? He basically says it's not true. What you're accusing of me sinning, it's simply just not true. Then Bildad brings his accusation against Job. He accuses Job of being a hypocrite, saying that he says he's innocent, but he knows that he's actually covering up his sin. So right away in chapter 8, verse number 1, Then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, How long wilt thou speak these things? And how long shall thy words of thy mouth be like a strong wind? How long are you just going to just be a windjammer and just say all these just lies? Verse number 3, Doth God pervert judgment? Or doth the Almighty pervert justice? If thy children have sinned against him, and he has cast them away for their transgression, if thou wouldest seek unto God betimes and make supplications to the Almighty, I have this underlined, verse number 6, if thou wert pure and upright, surely now he would awake for thee and make thy habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. If you actually were pure and upright, this wouldn't have happened. If your children wouldn't have sinned, they obviously wouldn't have gotten destroyed. That's what Bildad tells him. He's saying you're a hypocrite. You're saying one thing, but your life and the consequences of your life is obviously proving indifferent. So he accuses Job of being a hypocrite. Therefore, he thinks that God is just, his judgments are just, and Job's a hypocrite. Job makes a case for his innocence. Chapter 9, verse number 22. Chapter 9, verse number 22. This is one thing, therefore I said it. He destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. What does Job say here? Bad things happen to pure, righteous people and to unrighteous people. Very simply, he says this one thing, he destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. It's God's prerogative to have bad things happen to good people and to bad people. Bad things happen to pure and to wicked people, therefore my suffering is not an indication that I had sinned. Then finally, Zophar, his third friend, he just comes straight out and calls Job a liar to his face. So chapter 11, verses 3 through 5. Chapter 11, verse number 3. Should thy lies make men hold their peace? They're saying, do you think you can make us be quiet just by you continually telling us lies? Verse number 3. And when thou mockest, shall no man make thee ashamed? Verse number 4. For thou hast said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in thine eyes. Verse number 5. But oh, that God would speak and open his lips against thee. He straight up is saying, I wish that God would expose your lies. You are a liar. You just continue to tell us lies that you're innocent, and it's just simply not true. You're a liar. God is just. God is punishing Job because he sinned, and Job is straight up lying about it. By the end of the beginning of this dialogue, Job is very frustrated with his friends because he now has 3 men in a row calling him a liar, a hypocrite, and that he's accusing him of sinning. Chapter number 13, verses 1 through 5. You can see the heaviness of Job and his frustration to his friends, verses 1 through 5 of chapter 13. Lo, my eyes hath seen all this, mine ear hath heard and understood it. What ye know, the same do I know also. I am not inferior unto you. Job's kind of standing up for himself, saying, even though I'm in a lower spot, I'm not inferior to you. What you know, I know as well. Verse number 3, surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. Verse number 4, but ye are forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. Job simply states, you guys are just forging lies, and I would that you guys would just keep your mouths shut, and that would be your wisdom. So we have three basic arguments in chapters 3 through 37, and we'll look at these in total. Job simply says, I have not sinned, therefore my punishment is unjust. I'm not being punished because I sinned, which he doesn't say this, but it kind of leads to the conclusion of one of two things. Either God doesn't rule the universe based on the justice system, or God himself is unjust or inconsistent in judgment. That's what Job kind of leads us to believe. The three friends simply point out that God is just. He does rule on the justice system. And the conclusion is that Job obviously sinned, and his sin is being punished. Then in chapter 32, Elihu, the youngest of the friends, he speaks out and speaks up against Job and the other three friends, and he draws his own conclusion. So we're going to jump all the way to chapter 34. Do you want to jump forward all the way to chapter 34? Verse number 10 through 12. And he's speaking to not just Job, but he's talking to the other three friends as well. Verse number 10 of chapter 34, I'll begin. Therefore hearken unto me, ye men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should commit iniquity. For the work of man shall he render unto him, and cause every man to find according to his ways. Verse number 12, yea, surely God will not do wickedly, neither will the Almighty pervert judgment. Elihu is firm in the belief that God is not unjust. God does rule by the justice system. So he begins by saying God's not unjust and he doesn't do wickedly. We're just going to make that clear. But unlike Job's other three friends, Elihu never actually accuses Job of sinning. He does give some illustrations and some examples maybe of how God's chastisement works, either for purification from sin or to improve somebody's character or to test them. But he never actually accuses saying Job sinned like the other three friends. The other three friends were pretty upfront about that. Elihu doesn't do that. He actually paints a picture of God's chastening. So we're going to look at chapter 33, verses 19 through 30, and we're going to see how this works. This is his picture that he paints of maybe this is what happened to Job. Okay, 33 verses 19 through 22. First, we see the chastening of a man. He is chastened also with pain upon his bed, and the multitude of his bones with strong pain, so that his life abhorreth bread, and his soul dainty meat. Verse number 21, his flesh is consumed away, that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. Yea, his soul draweth near unto the grave, and his life to the destroyer. So here, this is actually painting a beautiful picture. Well, not beautiful, a vivid description of what Job's life was. He was under so much pain and distress that he was nearing the grave and he was being delivered to the destroyers. But he shows that there is a messenger, somebody that can show him the right path. Verse number 23. If there be a messenger with him, an interpreter, one among 1,000, to show unto man his uprightness. Now, he doesn't say Job, he just says to a man. Show unto man his uprightness, then we see restoration, verses 24 through 28. Then he is gracious unto him, meaning God is gracious unto him, and has said, deliver him up from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. His flesh shall be fresher than a child's. He shall return to the days of his youth. He shall pray unto God, and he will be favorable unto him. And he shall see his face with joy, for he will render unto a man his righteousness. He looketh upon man, and if any say, I have sinned or perverted that which is right, it profited me not. He will deliver his soul from going down to the pit, and his life shall see the light. So Elihu doesn't necessarily accuse Job of sinning outright. He doesn't say he doesn't necessarily assume why God was doing what he was doing in Job's life, but he paints some different pictures of maybe why God was doing this. Maybe it was to restore a child, maybe it was to punish, could be to punish, or it could be a character building, but he never actually accuses Job of sinning. So, all of this to leave a cliffhanger. Who is right? Why did God do all of these things to Job? Is Job right? Are his 3 friends right? Is Elihu right? In chapters 38 through 42, God answers Job directly out of a whirlwind. So next week, we will look at God's answer of who was right in the situation. And you may go ahead and read ahead and find out what the answer is. But next week, we'll look at God's answer to Job, who was right, and then we'll finish up in Paul's conclusion to his question that Paul asked the same question. Is there unrighteousness or inconsistency with God? What's the answer? So we'll look at that next week. Father, thank you for the time we could spend together as we look at the life of this man Job and some of the inquiries that